Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our conversation this evening. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find nearly 1,000 articles, hundreds of event recordings, dozens of podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Those of you looking for a more interpersonal experience should also check out our Gotham Ed, our online education program offering mini courses taught by leading experts. You can view our 2025 catalog now at gothamed.com. Those of you who follow the Gotham Center know that during the academic year, we regularly feature author interviews, spotlighting some of the best and most interesting new research on New York City history. But occasionally we also do something a little different, assembling panels of historical experts to weigh in on issues facing New Yorkers today. No issue, it feels sometimes, figures larger in the everyday lives of people than housing. Stories about rent perennially shock and feel impervious to downturn and disaster as we experienced most recently with the radical increase of prices after the pandemic and the commodities inflation that followed soon thereafter. Rent has always been a hot topic in New York, but in recent decades, it has been exacerbated by the declining rates of home ownership in the US too, which make themselves felt particularly strongly in those major job-producing areas like New York, where sticker prices quickly lead to despair. According to a report from the National Association of Realtors, which is still barnstorming its way across the internet, the median homebuyer price in America is now 56 the median homebuyer age in America is now 56 years old, up from 49 years old just last year. Insofar as housing featured in the recent presidential campaign, it was the usual smattering of modest tax credits and the like. But if we are looking for bold ideas from the past that might still provide us with a solution today, cooperative housing is certainly one. And this is an area where New York, once again, has something particular to offer. Nowhere else saw cooperative housing building on such a scale. And in terms of the problem we have before us, how to create affordable housing in cities that are racked by constant price increase, co-ops are a program that work. They remain islands of affordability in a city that is ever less affordable. So to that end, we have gathered a pair of historical experts along with a seasoned executive in the housing opportunity space to discuss what is living and what is dead in cooperative housing today. I'll stop here, but allow me to very briefly introduce our moderator this evening who will be steering conversation. Rob Snyder is Emeritus Professor of Journalism and American Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, and the author of numerous works on the history of New York City. For the last 4 years, he has also served as the official Manhattan Borough Historian, where, among other things, he has sought out venues to host more historically informed public debate about such issues as affordable housing. So before we start, just one last piece of housekeeping. As usual, the chat and hand-raising feature functions in Zoom have been disabled out of respect to our speakers. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do so at any point in the next hour of conversation, and we will begin answering your questions at around 7:30 or so. So with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming our guests with a bit of silent applause.
Thank you, Peter. Peter Eisenstack, Lynn Robbins, Margy Brown, welcome. Join us.
Hi, Rob. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, all. As New York City struggles with an acute shortage of affordable housing, it's useful to remember that New Yorkers once built cooperative housing for people with low and moderate incomes on a massive scale. Central to this effort was the United Housing Foundation, or UHF, an offshoot of the city's labor movement. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the UHF built large cooperative apartment complexes such as Penn South in Manhattan, Rochdale Village in Queens, and Co-op City in the Bronx. The United Housing Foundation is gone, and its cooperatives have changed in many ways, but they remain islands of affordable housing in an increasingly expensive city. What can we learn from this history as we confront New York City's housing crisis today? Tonight, two historians and a housing policy expert with us explore what we can learn from the history of the United Housing Foundation and its works, how its lessons about what went well and what did not can help us better respond to the shortage of affordable housing in New York City today. Margy Brown is Executive Director of the Urban Homesteading Assistance Program. She was previously the Associate Commissioner of Housing Opportunity and Program Services at New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Peter Eisenstadt is the author of many books, including the award-winning Rochdale Village, Robert Moses' 6,000 Families, and New York City's Great Experiment in Integrated Housing. He's finishing a book on Jackie Robinson and the Meaning of Integration. Glyn Robbins is a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University and a Fulbright Scholar at Rutgers University, Newark. He's working on a biography of Abraham Kazin, founder of the United Housing Foundation. Let me start just asking a question of Glyn. Glyn, what was the United Housing Foundation and what did it accomplish that's so important?
Well, it accomplished a lot. It was, I suppose today we think of it as an NGO or a community benefit organization, but it was very different from that model because, as you said, it was fundamentally based around New York City's powerful, at the time, trade union movement. And I suppose it had two wings, really. One was as a development agency to build the homes, to find the sites and all that goes with that sometimes complicated, often overcomplicated process. But it was also, to some extent, an ideological endeavor. There was a set of principles that I guess we'll get into that underpinned what the UHF did. And Kazan in particular, but also the many people who assisted him, it wasn't just him, was very keen to promote the idea of cooperativism.
Peter, could you say a little bit about the ideas and values attached to the United Housing Foundation?
Well, Kazan started building cooperative housing in the 1920s. The United Housing Foundation organized, I think maybe Glyn knows the precise year, around 1950. I forget precisely. And as Glyn said, it was very much connected to the union movement, connected to particularly the Jewish part of New York City's labor movement. It was always close to the Amalgamated Housing Workers and the ILGWU, which were two large garment industry unions. Kazan came out of an anarchist tradition that emphasized building affordable, doing cooperative things in the present rather than waiting for socialism to come and changing the government. It was the belief that things can be done in the here and now, and you don't have to wait for the future. And his vision of cooperation was encompassing. It was housing, it was stores, it was the belief, and this came out of the cooperative movement, which started in England in 1840s in Rochdale, in the city of Rochdale in England, which is how Rochdale Village got its name, that cooperation, consumer-based cooperatives were a vitally important way for working people to pool their resources and create prosperity for themselves.
So at one end, the United Housing Foundation has this vast image of it in its mind of housing, stores, recreational facilities, all of these built into its communities. But at the same time, there's a very specific financial mechanism that's going to explain how people pay for their apartments and how they bankroll the facilities themselves. And that's the notion of limited equity cooperatives. Margy, could you explain that to us so we understand its value?
Yeah, sure. So a limited equity co-op is a homeownership model in which residents purchase shares in a development rather than each purchasing a discrete piece of physical property. Each shareholder receives a proprietary lease to a unit that is their home. But a key principle of co-ops is that all of the homeowners are owners of the whole housing development and have a shared interest in seeing the whole development thrive. It's a model that's really based on community and community control. It's also a model that emphasizes affordability. The purchase price of shares are set well below the market rate of a comparable apartment or unit to offer homeownership to low and moderate income people. And in order to keep the housing affordable over the long term, shareholders commit to reselling their shares at a moderate price increase. So there's not the expectation of huge appreciation and a windfall upon sale. Essentially, people are able to get out what they put in plus a little. The overall idea is that the value of a home is living in it. It's not what we see so much of today, of like a really commodified idea of housing in which the eventual sales price is seen as the real value. It's kind of an interesting principle that we now kind of see the value of a home as when you leave. So it's really a model that that emphasizes community and a home while you live in it and cooperation.
Lynn, how did you learn about Kazan and what inspired you to get to work on a biography about him?
I got to learn about him by living in the Bronx, actually. This is my second Fulbright. I'm greedy like that. And in 21, I was living on Allerton Avenue, which people may know because of its association with another famed co-op, the Coops, which was at one end of Allerton, and at the other end was Co-op City. And I've been working in housing for many years, and I'm also a trade unionist and socialist. And so I was very intrigued by these places and wanted to find out more about how they came to be. And that led me towards Kazan, and in particular to the original amalgamated in the Bronx, which I've been to many times, and which I hope will celebrate its centenary in 2027. It's the oldest still established existing cooperative in the US, housing cooperative. And it occurred to me that no one had written Kazan's story. Now, that was partly of his own volition, really, because he wasn't a person, I don't think, who craved attention or notoriety, unlike some of the other people that are around him. But he did remarkable things. You know, the UHF is responsible for over 30,450, I make it, homes in the city. And, you know, he wasn't alone, as I said earlier, but he was the driving force behind those homes, many of which have stood the test of time now. Sadly, and he certainly would, I think, be sad about it, some of them have subsequently become private cooperatives, have become, if you like, capitalist co-ops rather than socialist co-ops. But nonetheless, I think what he left us with was a model, which Margy's just described very well, about housing can be, if you like, insulated from the volatility of the housing market that is causing so much damage, not just in New York City, but everywhere, and including my own home city of London. So, yeah, someone needed to do it, Rob, and you weren't doing it. So I guess it was down to me.
Peter, how did the United Housing Foundation pay for its cooperatives and acquire the land that they needed to go to work?
Well, let me just say, I don't know when, I think about 2 years ago, Glenn emailed me out of the blue saying he wanted to write a biography of Abraham Kazan. I thought it was a great idea, and I'm so glad he's doing it. Well, I mean, acquiring land was, you know, always a problem. The difference between housing cooperatives and most other types of cooperative is that you have to build the buildings for people to live in before you can have a cooperative. And that requires a lot of initial money from some source. And, the people living in the building, they have down payments for their rooms, as Margy was explaining, but there needs to be outside sources of funding to acquire the land and to put the building up. The amalgamated houses were were in the Bronx. Hazen in the 30s did some cooperative in Lower East Side, and then when the Hazen's idea was to build bigger and bigger cooperatives. He believed that it was important to create the culture of a cooperative. And if it was too small, it would just be infected by outside people. He built Penn South, south of Penn Station. There were problems about tenant relocation and buildings being torn down to build it. He tried to do another cooperative in Cooper Village, right? Cooper Square, and that's been written about. And after that, the UHF. He also did some things in Brooklyn. The two biggest projects were Rochdale Village, which was built on the former Jamaica racetrack in South Jamaica, and Co-op City, that was built on an amusement park, Freedom Land, and in the Pelham Bay area, and that avoided tenant locations because those areas were basically, it didn't have people, just horses and merry-go-rounds and stuff like that.
Margy, as we try to think about the possibility of replicating some of the successes of the United Housing Foundation today, is a shortage in land that's available to build on one of the problems?
Absolutely. Yeah. Development has changed so much overall in terms of largely what opportunities there are. And one of the major things that developments in New York City right now is the City of Yes, which is changes to zoning that permit new both affordable housing and other types of housing to be built. But something that's interesting is like United Housing Foundation approach was, these kind of mammoth developments of 100% affordable housing in a few discrete areas, and like the City of Yes changes, and the type of development that we see now is really around like a little more housing in every neighborhood. That's really the type of opportunity that you see when we already have such like dense land use around the city already.
I know that Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine identified about 170 sites in Manhattan where affordable housing could be built. But my understanding is there are a few that are on a massive scale of the kind that you had in both Co-op City or Rochdale Village. I want to come back to the City of Yes and the city that produced the UHF a little bit later, but I want to ask Peter for a second. You lived in Rochdale Village. You grew up there. And what was it like living there? What were its joys? What were its problems? Tell us about that.
Well, we moved to Rochdale in 1964 when I was 10 years old. It was still being built, and we really liked it. It was you still could find like nails of shoehorns and stuff like that in when we were there, and it's like Kazan really built things very quickly, and like the first build, there were 20 buildings in Rochdale. We moved there, and like a lot of it was still under construction. I mean, it was a lot of fun. In my book, I write a lot about race and integration. Um, um, Rochdale Village was on the site of the former Jamaica racetrack, which was in South Jamaica. And the original population of Rochdale was about 80% white, 20% African American, which is sort of an unheard of mixture in New York City at the time. Things like Lefrak City and other big developments had like 2 or 3% African American participation. And given the history of our housing foundation, it was very heavily Jewish. And something like 80% of the white families were Jewish. And it certainly was a place where people were proud of integration and talked about it. One thing about the cooperative is that they really emphasize cultural life, that within a year, there were like 150 different organizations of all sorts in Rochdale. They really encouraged culture. There was the big cultural center that they built. And and I had, so we moved out, when I was about 19, and it was like a chat room about 25 years ago that got me involved and made me realize that there's a real story about Rochdale Village that hasn't been told. And I decided to write it.
Glenn, it strikes me that there's both a utopian stream and a pragmatic stream in the history of the United Housing Foundation. And let's start with the pragmatic stream. Kazan worked with some very powerful patrons, the labor leader Sidney Hillman, the master builder Robert Moses, the man so many New Yorkers love to hate. What was his relationship with these powerful people like?
I'm glad you asked. I was about to piggyback on what Peter and Margy were just talking about, and I thought, we're going to get through the whole session without mentioning Moses, but
impossible.
Apparently. And, I think it's fair to say, contentious a character though he is, and I understand the reasons why, Kazan and the UHF couldn't have done what they did without him. There's a variety of reasons for that, but, he is an essential part of the story. There are many others. But I think there's another important point to make about Moses' involvement, which partly relates to this whole question of affordable housing, which is very contentious in New York City at the moment, as it is in many other places. But I think it's important to remember that there's nothing new about contentious definitions of affordability, because one of my criticisms actually of what Kazan and the UHF did was that a lot of what they produced was not affordable for many people. And I mean, it certainly wasn't reaching the people in the most housing need. Now, there's a quite complex political policy discussion to have about that, but they were very explicit, both Kazan and Moses. We are building homes for what they classified as middle income people. And I think I'd add to that a kind of subjective and respectable middle income people at that, people like Peter, obviously. But Kazan described himself as a practical dreamer. That probably will be the title of the book. That's how he thought of himself. He's a doer, and that's partly why he could work with Moses, because they both had this very practical approach. But he was, as you say, a utopian as well. And as Peter has said, a fundamental and important part of what the UHF did was, this is not just a home. This is, if you like, a lifestyle. You're buying in with your limited equity to a culture, to an ideology. And that was as important to Kazan as the buildings themselves.
I was struck. Go ahead, Peter.
Let me add that one thing, two things. First, if you read Robert, Caro's famous book, The Power Broker, you will not find a word about Rochdale Village, Co-op City, United Housing Foundation, Abraham Kazan. And as Glenn said, there are questions you can raise about it, but it's completely something he did not discuss. And 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 that's one thing. The other thing is the United Housing Foundation grew in the 1950s when there was a tremendous fear of and reality of whites leaving New York City and whites going to the suburbs, and that New York City would become a city of poor people and rich people, and the middle class was gone. Um, the New York City Housing Authority built housing that was a little less expensive than the UHF cooperative. And certainly in cases where there was tenant relocation, a lot of and this goes back to Stuyvesant Town and other earlier developments, they built buildings and the people who were displaced could not afford housing in the areas where they were displaced. And this became very controversial. Um, but so, there was a belief that by keeping the middle class, they were keeping basically the white middle class in the city. The United Housing Foundation did not have any racial barriers, and certainly in Rochdale, they encouraged Black cooperators buying into the property. But part of the reason for the success of the United Housing Foundation was the sense that you needed to build affordable housing in New York City to keep people in New York City.
Lynn, in some of my reading to get ready for tonight, I came across descriptions of United Housing Foundation cooperatives, and I uncovered the idea that sometimes the leadership of the UHF thought the residents of their communities didn't fully absorb cooperative principles the way they wished. And at the same time, the residents of UHF communities thought that the UHF was just another bunch of landlords masquerading under another name. Is there any truth to this? How would you respond to these two charges?
Well, definitely guilty as charged, I think. No, I mean, Kazan complained about this lack of commitment almost from the outset, almost from the moment that the amalgamated in the Bronx was complete in 27. They're only here because they want somewhere to live. Well, I personally think that's a reasonable expectation. I've never fully accepted, and I've worked in this field as well, why it is that sometimes working class people are expected to go to loads of meetings in order to justify having a truly affordable and secure home. But that said, as we talked about, Kazan was on a mission, if you like, and he wanted to promote this idea of cooperativism, which he did think was, if you like, the solution to capitalism in one sense. But a lot of these issues did come to a head somewhat later in the early 70s at Co-op City. And I think we're going to mention a book that's on that subject. And it turned very messy at Co-op City for a variety of reasons. But one of them was that there was a gap, as you've indicated, between what the UHF thought they were doing for people, as it were, and what residents were experiencing, which was a fairly rapid, or very rapid increase in the charges that they were being faced with. And so this whole question of, well, are we cooperators? Are we tenants? Are we residents? What are we? These definitional problem issues became quite stark at Co-op City, and sadly did mark it wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the end of the United Housing Foundation, as Peter has written in his book rather eloquently, it died of a broken heart. And that was partly because I think Kazan would have said he actually died in 71. In a way, that's good. He didn't get to see how bad it turned at Co-op City, although Co-op City is still there, let it be said. And I've been there recently, and I think, again, has stood the test of time. But yeah, this was a problem throughout, and Kazan was very conscious of it.
Yeah, one thing we might want to clarify, that when Rochdale Village and co-ops, one point of the cooperative was that they were owned, as Margy was saying, by the people living in the housing collectively. And when these cooperatives opened, the United Housing Foundation managed the cooperatives, and they were in charge of the early planning and the building. But the whole point eventually was that the cooperative people living in the apartments would take over control of the cooperative themselves. And I think this happened in all of the cooperatives, and the United Housing Foundation executives were replaced by people living in the cooperative themselves, and there often was real tension between, complaints and that they were replacing an older UHF administration with their own administration. And as Glenn said, this led to all sorts of problems. Co-op City was built on marshy land in Pelham Bay. It was fine for an amusement park. It probably wasn't the best place for 25-story buildings. And there was real inflation in the 1960s. Anyway, we could talk about that, but it's important to remember that the goal of the cooperative eventually was for the people living in the buildings to manage the cooperative themselves.
And just quickly to add on to that, there was a particularly important campaign to that end at Penn South, which is still a mutual cooperative, incidentally, led by a character called Dave Smith, who insisted on this level of resident control of the co-op.
Just want to double back for a second now and ask, how do these old United Housing Foundation cooperatives fit into the landscape of affordable housing today? Are they a big presence, or, how should we see them in context? Margy?
Yeah, sure. So certainly in terms of numbers, it is still a large number of affordable housing units, and especially co-op units, affordable co-op units in the city. They're very interesting for a number of reasons, both for the level of affordability they've maintained, to the point that they were initially really middle income housing. While the income limits today are still at moderate or middle income, there's really a wide range of residents of those buildings in terms of income levels, both people who have been there for a long time and have increased in income, and also because they are affordable, really people pretty well below middle income levels, low income levels can qualify. And so they're very meaningful in terms of like an affordable housing stock in the city, and a resource for a more diverse type and more diverse population of homeowners.
Roughly how many people today live in apartments built by the United Housing Foundation?
100,000.
100,000?
Mm-hmm.
That's substantial. Margy, you follow affordable housing very closely. How does the United Housing Foundation's vision compare to the vision that we see in the city of Yes?
Yeah, so it's so interesting that, kind of harking back to what I was saying before, that it is kind of such a stark, almost polar opposite of very large scale developments versus like the tagline of for City of Yes was a little more housing in every neighborhood. I will say one of the interesting opportunities, I think, that comes out of City of Yes that is more like United Housing Foundation type development is potentially in the office conversions. City of Yes is really trying to unlock office to residential conversions because we're seeing so much like unused office space. And so, office conversions are tricky, and co-ops can be tricky to finance. But I do think that seeing some office to co-op conversions is a really exciting opportunity, and something that from where I sit, and I know others nationally, are really interested in trying to make happen.
One thing that occurs is funding. Where does the money come from to accomplish affordable housing? And how were these original United Housing Foundation projects funded? I mean, I raised that earlier, but I think we need a more explicit answer. What was the role of government? What was the role of the state? How did this work?
Well, maybe Peter would say a bit more, but I mean, it was what we used to call in the jargon a kind of cocktail of funding, essentially, and some of it came from the unions directly and their pension funds, which were considerable by this point. But the thing that comes out to me very clearly when I'm doing the research is none of this could have happened without significant political support backed with public money. Whether that was in the form of tax abatements or various other, I suppose you could call them subsidies, but I wouldn't call them that. I would call them investments in the kinds of homes that people needed. None of it could have happened without the political support, be it at city or state level. So putting the funding together was difficult. And then there was borrowing privately, from Bowery savings banks and indeed the Amalgamated Bank, which was another offshoot of the cooperative movement in New York City and still exists. So, but none of this happens. And I think this is a really important point, and it applies not just to cooperatives. None of this happens without serious political support backed with public money.
And that's where Robert Moses comes into the story, that the earlier UHF cooperatives were built with largely, I think, with money lent from union pension funds. And a lot of those were under Title I of the 1949 Housing Act. 1956, New York State passed the Mitchell-Lama law, which gave tax abatements. You could defer tax for a number of years, and it kept things low. Rochdale, as opposed to previous UHF cooperative, was funded largely from state pension funds. I think a state pension fund, the teachers' pension fund. Kazin met with Rockefeller to do this. Moses had become a big fan of Kazin and the United Housing Foundation, and appreciated how efficiently that they built things. Glenn shared with me a comment, I think, from the opening of Co-op City, groundbreaking, where he praised the socialism of the United Housing Foundation. And so yeah, I mean, that, they're an odd couple, sort of like Kazin and Moses, sort of like the former anarchist and somebody who was most committed to like big government. But, the thing I think to keep in mind is that they came out of a social democratic New York, which has vanished, that the unions were much more powerful than they are now. And the unions were concerned with not just wages, but creating life for better lives in all sorts of ways for their members, including housing. And Moses accomplished what he did because he had allies, and he found allies in the labor movement, and they gave the wherewithal to do it. I mean, I think things began to fall apart in the late 60s and early 70s. Jane Jacobs hated the United Housing Foundation. She hated super block buildings. She wanted streets, and I guess most people are familiar with her argument. By the late 60s, the sort of projects like Rochdale and Co-op City were being bitterly criticized by lots of architects as being old-fashioned. And then finally, beyond the specific problems in Co-op City, the fiscal crisis in the mid-70s sort of doomed the possibility of large-scale government funding for this. And afterwards, I think it, largely became private developers. And, like the city of Yes and other things, it's sort of like private developers want their profit, and then a certain percentage of housing is made affordable. And that's been the model, I think, for most housing development since in New York City. And it's the reason why massive projects like Rochdale and Co-op City, all of which have long waiting lists to get in, no longer have been built.
Go back to Co-op City for a minute, because in some ways it was not only the biggest of the United Housing Foundation communities, it was also the one that was their last. And this, it's been described as United Housing Foundation's Vietnam, right? And yet I was listening to a Zoom lecture with Anne-Marie Sammartino, who wrote a wonderful book called Freedom Land about Co-op City. And she described a combination of problems, but real virtues to the place. And I'm wondering if any of you want to speak to that. What were the strengths of it? What did it reveal about the strengths of the UHF? What were the limits and problems at Co-op City? We've spoken about how carrying charges went up, but why did they go up? And why were so many people sympathetic to the rent strikers? And yet at the same time, how has it lasted so well as long as it has? Anyone want to speak to that longer history of Co-op City and what it means to us?
Well, I will say something about it, having been there recently.
Yeah.
Obviously that's very impressionistic. I've been several times actually. And I mean, I sometimes look at these questions from the point of view of somebody who was a housing worker for many years. And this to me bears all the hallmarks of a place that works. It's beautifully maintained. It's a pleasant environment. I mean, some people have a problem with high-rise buildings, but when the words of Kazan, a building is for living in, not looking at. And I think Co-op City, as I've said earlier, has stood the test of time. Now, obviously, residents would have their own perspective on that, but certainly the ones that I've met appear happy with their accommodation. Of course, they will be unhappy with charges going up as they did, and partly for the reasons that Peter said, and the fiscal crisis, and maybe the foundations and so on at the beginning of the projects, and maybe it was, as it were, a hole beneath the water initially, but actually it's survived. But again, it survived largely because politicians were prepared to put public money where their mouths were and make sure that it survived. And of course, you only have to think about what the consequences for a place like New York City would be if places like Co-op City didn't exist. How essential, and I would say the same about NYCHA, incidentally, which we haven't talked about public housing yet, something that Moses and Kazan also had in common. They were born within 3 days of each other, by the way, but they also were, I would say, feverishly hostile to public housing, which I'm not. I'm a staunch supporter of it, both here and at home in the UK. But if you took the UHF homes and public housing through NYCHA out of New York City, what kind of city would it be?
Yeah, Margy, do you want to speak to that too, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that absolutely agreed that these large scale developments, were and are so important. They do represent different income levels, really, in terms of who they predominantly serve, but to income levels that, like, in the context of particularly today's New York, the market does not serve. And so preserving these for the long term and expanding the opportunity for to create more is really very important. I will say, with regard to particularly creating more as well as to preserving them, Glenn, you had said before, none of this happens without public money. Absolutely true. I would also say one of the challenges is none of this happens without federal money. And there are so fewer opportunities for federal dollars to be used for cooperatives than for rental housing.
Why is that? That's fascinating. Why is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the primary thing is just the kind of ubiquity of the low-income housing tax credit. So low-income housing tax credits were introduced in 1986. And they're really a federal tax credit to investors of affordable housing, but it acts like a federal subsidy. It's money toward the construction or rehabilitation of housing. And federal, just in terms of, to give an idea of scale, since 1986, federal tax credits have been used in the construction or rehab of about 4 million units of affordable housing nationwide. And so they really are just such a large generator. But in addition to federal tax credits, there are other federal sources, federal home funds, for instance, that are put into affordable, primarily rental housing. For cities and states to be able to construct at particularly a large scale, they need to leverage their more limited dollars with a federal source. Otherwise, they're just not kind of maximizing the number of overall units that they could create. And so on the side of trying to build co-ops, we always hear, there's primarily just city and state sources for co-ops. So, a huge priority toward building more co-ops, particularly large-scale co-ops, is to have more federal sources. There are changes to tax credit law and to other sources of federal funding that could be made to accommodate co-ops. And it's something that from UHAB and from others, we're really looking to see.
Yeah, can I just quickly add?
Let me just ask Margy a question, a follow up on that. Is there a preference for funding for rental housing as opposed to cooperative housing? And if that's so, why?
Yeah, so I do think that most people just think of affordable housing in terms of rentals, and I do think that there is some classism and racism behind that. That we think of lower income people as being renters. But homeownership offers so much more than just, like I was saying at the beginning, so much more than just the equity building that happens. But the conversation around homeownership and what people see so much now as the value of homeownership is for moderate and higher income people, middle and higher income people, to be able to build wealth. And to think of homeownership much more as community control and individual control and participation in your housing really kind of opens up that idea to say, this should be open to everybody.
Lynn, you were starting to say something.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to quickly add, I often say housing comes down to politics in the end. And I can think of 3 US presidents who made their support for cooperative housing very, explicitly. Letters written to Kazan and the UHF by FDR, by Truman, by Lyndon Johnson. These were not socialists, much less anarchists, but the political climate made it, if you like, possible for them to express their support for this alternative to private development.
Now, when UHF cooperatives go private, what happens in that? What takes place?
Well, I think it's like where any building goes private. It happened, that you've been paying carrying charges, which is similar to rent. And when it's privatized, they decide what you purchase your apartment at a certain price, and then you can sell it individually at whatever the market bears. It was hard, you know. I'm Margy might know this. I know there were in both in Rochdale and Co-op City, there were various efforts to privatize them. I think it required 2/3 of the residents in the cooperative to agree to privatize it. And I think the largest UHF cooperative avoided privatization. I think some of those in Manhattan, where I think, I mean, you know, the potential financial gain was great, that they did privatize. And, you know, it's like, then you own your apartment and you can sell it whenever you want. And I think, you know, the United Housing Foundation grew at a time when real estate speculation was not as central to people's thought as it has become over the last 30, 40 years. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. People can rent and not put all their money into housing and put money into the stock market and investments, and they can grow their wealth otherwise. And I think it's a fixation on housing as maybe the most important way to increase one's wealth. I think it is one thing that has really changed, I think, over the last half century, and one thing that makes limited equity cooperatives, I think, less appealing as a strategy. But as we've been saying, they all work very well, and it's a pity. And Kazin really believes it, as Glenn said, housing is a place to live, not a source of speculation. And you know, as long as that remains the dominant view of housing development, you know, I think it's a real problem for building new limited equity cooperatives.
Margy, what some of the buildings that the United Housing Foundation built are by now getting old. You know, you know, time has passed. They need upkeep. You know, in some cases, corners were cut in quick construction in UHF projects so that things had to be repaired and replaced. What are some of the financial problems that these older buildings face today that we have to think about?
Yeah, sure. So I do think that there is a lot of concern about that right now, and kind of there in some of the City of Yes negotiations too. I believe that the City Council, in their kind of counter proposal, even created a task force to look at some of this and to look at the needs of those buildings, because there is concern. And certainly there has been some investment in them over time from the city and state. But I do think that the kind of larger systems and things in these buildings are not as much as what has been addressed as the like kind of smaller maintenance needs. And so it's concerning, and is something that needs new sources. Again, getting back to the point that it's just hard to finance these things without federal sources. Again, just kind of going back to the tax credit model. Tax credits not only provide that like initial source of investment, but there's kind of a tax credit machine that happens for reinvestment too. If people are familiar with like year 15, that as the investor exits from the project, there's like an opportunity for recapitalization that happens. It does mean that rental projects tend to get larger scale financing, and the maintenance needs that they really have. Because there's not that same type of financing mechanism for these very large co-ops that don't have tax credits in them, it does make it much more difficult.
Then when you walk around some of the older cooperatives like the amalgamated cooperatives and other places in the Bronx, and you look as a housing worker and a historian, what do you see in that landscape?
I see places that were very carefully designed and built. Herman Jesser was the sort of in-house, as it were, architect for the UHF. Somebody needs to write a biography about him as well. Instead, I think someone is working on it. But, the principle was we are going to build the best quality housing we can for working class people. And I think that is reflected if you go to the amalgamated in the Bronx. People haven't been. I would recommend just going up there and having a look around and just seeing the quality of the design, the landscaping, its location alongside Van Cortlandt Park and Jerome Reservoir and so on. These things didn't happen by accident. They were planned and very deliberate. And I think it's an example to us in the sense that when I look at a lot of housing that's being built today, it's just not of the same quality. And yes, some of them are getting very old, and yes, they do need maintenance. But as I said earlier, you don't spend money on housing, you invest money in housing. And I think what often gets left out of this discussion when it comes to the level of government support is what are the opportunity costs, i.e. what happens if we don't invest in maintaining some of the houses that we're talking about? The cost to the public purse will be far greater if we lose places like the Amalgamated and Rochdale Village and Penn South and Co-op City. In the end, we will end up paying more than we will by maintaining them at the level that they should be maintained at. And otherwise, I think certainly the Amalgamated, which is the oldest, is good for another 100 years. Rock solid, but it needs money.
I want to go to some questions that we're seeing in the chat right now. Let me double back and take a quick look. Question that came through: if Kazin and other founders of the United Housing Foundation could see their cooperatives now, how would they feel?
Well, he'd be sad about the ones that were privatized. I don't think there's any two ways about that. I think he may, understand some of the reasons why it's happened. But it would be a huge disappointment to him. But other than that, I think they would still point to the achievements as well.
Peter?
Yeah, what are the famous saying by, so Christopher Wren, look about you and there's your monument. I think Kazin would feel the same way, that, Rochdale Village, Co-op City, Penn South are thriving. There's a long waiting list of people wanting to get in. They work and they continue to work, and, with appropriate maintenance like other old buildings, there's no reason that they can't continue to serve the public indefinitely.
Now you have the UHF cooperatives and Mitchell-Lama housing cooperatives. How do the Mitchell-Lama co-ops compare to the United Housing Foundation cooperatives?
Rochdale Village and Co-op City were built under the Mitchell-Lama program. The previous UHF projects were built under Title I of the Housing Act, the Federal Housing Act of 1949. For reasons that have become a little fuzzy in my mind, Moses and Kazin wanted to go to Mitchell-Lama funding. By the way, the Mitchell-Lama, which gave tax incentives to and tax abatements to projects, came in 1956. Lots of people, not just nonprofit cooperators, used Mitchell-Lama housing. For-profit developers also could use Mitchell, I'll tell you a story, a quick story. Sometimes, you look in the New York Times, I look in the New York Times, and you want to find what is the first reference to a certain person. Like, when did Adolf Hitler first make the pages of the New York Times, or Joseph Stalin? And I did this for Donald Trump. And Donald Trump first made the New York Times about 1971, 72. And in like the first article, like extended article in the Times, and he was, in his late 20s, he was talking about this dynamic young housing. Of course, you talk about the president. Donald Trump, for better or for worse, is the only president who ever built housing in New York City. And he was talking about wanting to go into Manhattan and talking about, the west side of Hudson and, the Hudson Yards. It took decades and decades to develop. Oh, yes, I'm going to build housing, and I'm going to use Mitchell Lama program to make housing and make it affordable to people. This is like 1972 or 1973. And Fred Trump had used Mitchell Lama housing before. So, you could be a thief. But the point is that New York City and state, and to some extent the federal government, was encouraging building of middle income housing. And this all vanished, I think, after the fiscal crisis. And Donald Trump never again ever spoke about building affordable housing for people. And it's just a different time when developers could make money, for-profit developers make building affordable housing.
We're starting to run up on the last portion of our panel. We've got about no more than 15 minutes left. Peter, you've been watching the questions. Are there any things that you're seeing there that you'd like to sum up and put before us? Come back on camera and tell us.
Yeah, we have no shortage of questions from the audience, and I'm not surprised. People have a lot of questions, and let's see how much we can get through here. So some basic definitional questions. We already talked about the question of how the money was raised. Anthony Blake wants to know, in today's terms, what is considered affordable housing?
I can jump in on that. So overall, most types of affordable housing use a federal definition that is about 30% of housing costs to rent. To rent, or I'm sorry, 30% of income to housing costs, whether that's rent or maintenance plus mortgage. And so that is a pretty universal definition. One thing that is remarkable about the older co-ops especially is that for the most part they are more affordable than that today, and a lot of that even which is what I had spoken about earlier in terms of actually being available then to a wider band of people. There's the cap at I think in most of these it's about 125% of AMI, area median income. But if the overall housing costs are less than that, then people can qualify at a lower income.
Apologies. Thanks for that. So next question from Rebecca Bratspice. Hi, Rebecca. Many co-ops are now market rate, but in Queens and the Bronx are still very much middle income housing. You found a lot of middle income housing organized around co-ops. Can you still talk about this transition and whether maintaining this housing holds different challenges than maintaining limited equity co-ops? Margy, I'm afraid that might be a question for you, although if anyone wants to jump in on that.
So I think the question is kind of around what housers like to call naturally occurring affordable housing, like market rate co-ops that just are based on the market that they're in, are affordable to middle and moderate income people versus ones that are restricted by a regulatory framework of some sort. It's an interesting question in terms of, what can be done to preserve the affordability of naturally occurring affordable housing, as opposed to ones that are regulatory, restricted by a regulatory framework. Certainly, that it's something that I would like to see the government invest in, the city in particular invest in saying, there are incentives to keep that housing affordable by entering into some sort of regulatory framework. Earlier in the conversation, we talked about co-ops being cooperatively managed and cooperatively governed. And, it's really about democratic governance. And so it can be hard for a co-op that does potentially have upward market speculation to say, like, there is value in us remaining affordable. I think we see that from a lot of existing affordable co-ops like Mitchell Lamas and like UHF developments, but for a non-regulated co-op to come into a regulatory framework it takes democratic election to do so. And so, but it is something that I would love to see there be investment by the city in doing so, and incentives to do that, and for cooperators to understand that keeping housing affordable really keeps it affordable for themselves as well. When you have units being sold at much higher to much higher income people, there is more of a drive to bring up the maintenance costs as well, and to see the housing become less and less affordable. So for people to understand that it is in their interest to keep that housing affordable, even in the face of, upward market movement, is really something that we try to do as an organization at UHAB, and that we would love to see people take up.
Yeah, yeah. We've talked a lot about New York City, only fitting at the Gotham Center. But we've got a question here from Peter Tannen to the historians in the group. How would you compare the New York co-ops to the New Deal experiments in Greenbelt, the Greenbelt, Maryland, Green Hills, Ohio, and the Greendale, Wisconsin cooperatives? Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
I'll take a quick stab. I've been to the Greenbelt, just outside Washington, D.C. It's a very interesting place. I mean, it's an example of what could be done with federal government level support. Eleanor Roosevelt was a staunch supporter of that particular co-op, and indeed some of the UHF co-ops as well, and Kazan's work. There's only about 200 homes still at Greenbelt that continue to be cooperative as far as I'm aware. And to a large extent, the intention actually has been to extend that model throughout the country. But I think something we haven't really talked about, I don't think, enough, and maybe we go back to Kazan on this, is, the real estate lobby will do everything that it can to try and stop these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And they did what they could to try and stop the extension of cooperativism. And the two driving forces of Kazan's work really were twofold. One, to do something about slums. And let's not think that slums are a thing of the past, and they could indeed be a thing of the future. But also he was absolutely clear that we cannot trust private developers to provide the homes we need. And that's why he did what he did. And so, they stopped the extension of co-ops like Greenbelt and the others. There was a moment, there's an interesting historic moment when the US could have had a very different housing picture, one that would have looked more like the UK and Europe. But you know, the real estate lobby had its way then, and it continues to do so. It's partly why I worry about the city of yes, incidentally.
The questions keep on rolling in, and some of them are paragraphs, so you'll bear with me a second. I get distracted listening to these answers. So anonymous attendee writes, we have current residents of Mitchell-Lama co-ops who are also members of the Cooperatives United and Mitchell-Lama for Cooperatives United for Mitchell-Lama, an advocacy group working to preserve and expand the program. Some of us just had a meeting about the initial public financing of these co-ops and the continued financing needed to maintain them. We're wondering how the tax breaks are given to for-profit developers to set aside in their market developments or I'm sorry, I think probably why they are too few and too expensive for most New Yorkers who need housing. So-called affordable units compared to the financing needed to build and maintain these not-for-profit co-ops. We suspect funding co-ops would be far more cost-effective at creating more units and more deeply and permanently affordable. Does anyone have thoughts on this, and who wants to help us do this analysis? I think maybe they just that first part.
I have thoughts on it.
Yeah, jump in.
Sure. So I think that part of what they're asking about here is tax breaks like 421A. So 421A, there's been various versions of 421A over time, but the idea is that developers can provide a certain portion of their for-profit developments for affordable housing and receive tax breaks for that. Earlier versions of 421A were targeted to most of the housing that was created from them were targeted to about 60% of AMI, which is low income. And then in the most recent version, there is now a very newly passed version with new letters and numbers, but basically the same idea. But in the most recent version that was implemented, the primary units created were middle income units. And you know, the level that they were at, which was even above the highest kind of entry level for the UHF and Mitchell-Lama co-ops, so about 130% of AMI. It's just not a price point at which we need to be creating more housing. It's also not a population for which we really need to be creating more housing. The market is creating that housing. So totally understand the frustration with saying, how are we losing valuable tax dollars to that type of housing? And how are we incentivizing developers to build to create that type of housing rather than investing in something like homeownership and affordable homeownership? So, you know, the agreed with the sentiment. Again, I think that the reframing the emphasis on homeownership and on opportunities for homeownership is critical to seeing the type of investment in these buildings that we need, and also again just the federal sources. I do think too that kind of harking back to the UHF and how it was created, the union participation and the union interest, that is something that I think that we are seeing like very clear sparks of, and particularly geared toward cooperatives. So that is something that I see as like an exciting possibility.
Very quickly, that piece, there's a bigger point to make, I think, that, and this is true for my country as well as yours, we have a tendency to talk about non-market housing of all forms as being subsidized. but actually the amount of government money that is spent on the private market far, far, far outweighs what is spent on all forms of non-market housing. So the real subsidies, and this was true of Fred Trump as much as his son, the real subsidies are going to the private market. That's where the public
And
money
it's
is
always
going.
been the case, no?
Well, pretty much.
Yeah.
And that's, we talked about reframing. We need to reframe that side of this discussion.
Well, we're not going to have the time to get to all of these questions, but let me just kind of bundle a bunch of them and pose one last one before we have some closing thoughts. And this goes back to a point you made a second ago, a few minutes ago, Glenn. I mean, a lot of this really comes down to a question of politics. And so there's lots of folks writing in asking how we sort of change this. We can talk all day long about the success of these programs. Do we have any, we're in a different time than the period we're talking about. There's a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. Do you all see any, it's an unfair question to pose, but do you all see any potential avenues that are sort of neglected for changing the political math on these things?
Yeah, I will say, I think that one thing is, in every kind of environment, we need to think about what is the strategy to get it done. And while, we are seeing a federal administration with a developer in chief, which is not necessarily, cooperative housing is not developer driven. It's not developer centered. There is, I think, still a lot of bipartisan support for homeownership. And so to really think about pushing for this as homeownership opportunity, I think could be a strategy, at least to center more focus on cooperatives than just on rentals. The conversation on co-ops is a little too lost, and I do think that is one avenue to get it back.
I would quickly add to that. Sorry, Peter, but grassroots campaigning. I mean, New York City has some brilliant grassroots housing campaign organizations, and that as combined with trade unions, which, as others have said, are not the power that they were, but they're still quite significant. I went on the Labor Day parade in Manhattan back in the summer, and the unions haven't gone away. Right. And they're wealthy organizations.
Yeah.
Yes, I guess I wanted to follow on what Glenn is saying. I mean, if you look at Kaysen's life, he started, working for cooperatives that were built entirely, for stores, private cooperatives selling matzahs and other types of commodities. And eventually, there was enough of a push by unions and other people to build affordable housing that Al Smith and the administration in the 1920s took notice of this. And I think it's sort of a bleak season we're entering into for affordable housing and with the change of administrations. But the lesson is if people stand up for something and demand it and are organized and try to get something, hopefully government will listen. And I think, as Glenn just said, that there needs to be grassroots agitation for the sort of housing needs of the city. And we can't expect, certainly in the current political climate, this to be handed down to people. It needs to be fought for, organized. And, we need people like Glenn and Margy who have thought very carefully about the details of these issues and how to go about it. But it has to be, I think, a bottom-up sort of movement.
Glenn, I want to ask you to close with some thoughts that you shared with me, because I thought they were quite eloquent. You talked about walking from Penn South to Hudson Yards. And what does that journey tell us about New York City's past and its present?
Well, I think it does distill, I think, three different visions really of the present and future of the city, which I care very much about, incidentally, although I'm a Londoner. People will probably be familiar with Hudson Yards, which in a way symbolises the speculative development model, which is not doing anything to address housing need in the city, I would suggest. But just down the road, we have another model of housing present and future, which has been denigrated. But actually, I believe NYCHA should have an important part in the future of this city. And there's an attempt to demolish Chelsea Elliott Homes, which is just south of Hudson Yards, and just on the other side of 7th, 8th Avenue to Penn South, 8th and 9th, sorry, which stands there, as others have said, as a kind of island of secure, truly affordable housing in this sea of, well, despair, as Peter said right at the beginning. And we have to break the cycle of despair around housing. And I think when I compare those three different places and the kind of contribution they make to this city, I'm pretty confident about which ones I think deserve a place in the future, and it isn't Hudson Yards.
I want to thank Margy, Peter, and Glenn for all their comments tonight, and Peter for helping us get organized and along the way. If you're interested in these topics, I encourage you to read a couple books: Rochdale Village by Peter Eisenstadt and Freedom Land by Anne-Marie Sammartino. Both of those are published by Cornell University in the press. And Peter Eigner is posting in the chat a purchase code that gets you a 30% discount on each. I think both of those are much worth reading to understand the UHF in its time and its works. I'd also recommend another book published by Fordham University Press, and that's Just City by Jenny Baum. I think all three of those books are really valuable for giving you an introduction to a different New York, a different way of approaching housing. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. I want to thank the panelists for sharing their thoughts. I'm Robert Snyder, and good night from the Gotham Center for New York City History.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rob.
I feel nervous now because I'm not sure if we're still on or not.
I'm trying to leave. Anyway, Glenn, it's fine to finally have a chance to talk to you. And
I'm going to come down and visit you when I'm here next.
Yes, we should. I mean, it's a pity if we're just moving, but yes, we must get together. And Margy, it's been very nice getting to know you as well.
Yeah, likewise, Margy. And as I said, well, to both of you, but if you are coming to London before I come here again, then let me know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been so great to get to meet both of you, and just so interesting to hear all of your knowledge around this topic.
Yeah, likewise. It's bloody freezing in this room. I'm in a modern building, and if this is the standard of modern buildings, I'm sitting here freezing me what's-its off.
Okay.
The insulation is terrible. Anyway, that's probably a subject for another day. Modern building methods.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.